What's up, everyone? This is Jared Harris, and this is episode 2 of my brand new podcast, Beats by Jer. In keeping with last week's episode, which focused on the music and records that made 2022 such an exciting year for new releases, we're going to continue looking at one of the biggest albums of last year. This week, we will be focusing on Kendrick Lamar's 5th studio album, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, and how Lamar has created a record that acts as a foil to the genre of hip-hop through a deeply reflective narrative as a means of creating art. Released on May 13th, 2022, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers was Kendrick Lamar's highly anticipated, I cannot stress how anticipated this album was, but highly anticipated follow-up to 2017's Damn. There was very little indication that this album was actually going to happen until the week before, where Kendrick released the single The Heart Part 5. Anyone who is familiar with Kendrick knows that The Heart Part 5 naturally follows The Heart's Part 1, 2, 3, and 4, and he uses these singles not as album songs, but more as palate cleansers, almost to usher in the arrival of new work, and to almost create these little lines dividing different periods in his career. The Heart Part 5 dropped just a couple of days before Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, and it also signified the arrival of the upcoming record. This was the only single, and I'm hesitant to refer to the Heart Part 5 as a single for the album simply because it did not originally appear on Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. It has since been updated, and on streaming services, The Heart Part 5 is now the closing track. However, the original album ended with Mirror, not The Heart Part 5. You can understand my hesitancy in that sense, and it makes for a very interesting launch for the album. Surprise launches are always an interesting case study in music business. While few artists actually do them, as nobody is too big to fail, this strategy has become increasingly popular in the last decade. None have had as much success with this as Beyonce, and while I'm certain that both Adele and Taylor Swift could reach the same level, they've both yet to attempt, so we'll never really know. Despite all the hype surrounding this album, Kendrick was taking a risk with this strategy, one which paid off. Upon its release, all songs charted in the Billboard Top 100, 3 of the 18 tracks making the top 10. Musically, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers is a distinctly modern hip-hop album, and yet it sounds nothing like Kendrick's contemporaries. The beats are not as aggressive. There's very few samples, it feels like, and the album as a whole feels as though there's an intentional lack of bangers, as the kids would say. Despite this, there are a lot of great songs. The opening 3 tracks, United in Grief, N95, and Worldwide Steppers, is a winning combo. I also really enjoyed Count Me Out, Crown, Silent Hill, Savior, and the title track, Mr. Morale, all excellent examples of Kendrick's musicality, himself as a rapper, and his incredibly prolific lyricism. The record, however, is not Kendrick's most impressive work. That still remains to be, by far, To Pimp a Butterfly. That is his Rumors, his Abbey Road, his Appetite for Destruction, whatever benchmark you want to compare it to, that is the mountain which Kendrick summited once. And since then, almost intentionally has strayed so far from it, almost as a means of telling his audience that he is not trying to do that again, and is looking for more, looking to exercise his creativity in different directions. When thinking of the music on Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, I can't help but put it through the lens of Rick Rubin, who earlier this year released his book, The Creative Act. There's a particular quote that comes to mind. While the artist's goal is greatness, it is to also move forward. Rubin's book is a set of philosophies that looks to illustrate what it means to be a creative person and how we can exercise, harness, and protect our own creative spirits. It's a set of ideas that really looks to negate the thoughts of the audience, because what I like about this album might be the very reason you dislike this album, right? Everything is so subjective to our own preferences and experiences. But instead, he encourages artists to create art, because art is not good or bad. It simply is. And art should be something that satisfies you as a creator rather than seeking to please an audience. And I can't help but, having read that book this year, I can't help but revisit Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers with such a lens to better understanding it musically. The beats on the album are simple, stripped down, almost bare bone in some cases. The arrangements are not often all that lush or intricate. The spontaneity that you may have heard on To Pimp a Butterfly is almost entirely absent. It feels very calculated instead. There's use of gospel choirs, there's use of classical motifs through pianos and string arrangements, there's use of tap dancing, and all of that counters to very electronic and percussive beats. Musically, it's a very different album from Kendrick, and while it feels very modern, it also it feels entirely different from anything else that anyone else is making out there. I think the lack of lead up to the album, the lack of follow through since content on social media, interviews, press, whatever, and again, not to use the same word, but the lack of bangers, you know exactly what I mean by that, and there's no other word to describe it. The lack of all these things further contributes to this idea, this idea from Rubin, the idea of art for the sake of art and creativity for the sake of creativity. And I fully believe that Kendrick is on a very similar wavelength to that. I would definitely recommend actually checking out a conversation that Rubin and Lamar had from GQ magazine. They posted a video of it from 5-6 years ago following the release of To Pimp a Butterfly, and it sees the two artists bounce ideas back and forth about their process and the value of art and creativity, and it's truly an insightful conversation, one of which when you listen to, you'll see why I'm connecting these dots. While I had hoped the album would take shape similar to that of The Heart Part 5, this jazzy, disco, 70s soul kind of sound, I was not disappointed by the direction that Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers actually took, and I'm still floored by this album. It's still a record that I feel I am still unpacking, and having listened to it in preparation for recording this episode, there was so many layers to it thematically, lyrically, musically, that I still found myself peeling back. And for an album to stir up such a level of emotions, as well as to challenge the listeners to peel back those layers and to uncover more and more of it a year on, is incredibly impressive. So let's begin to peel back those layers and examine exactly what makes Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers a significant album. Through records like Good Kid, Mad City, To Pimp a Butterfly, and Damn, Kendrick has explored the Black experience through his lyrics, looking at themes of inner city politics, the want to escape the gangster lifestyle, the idea of survivor's guilt, along with how that can intersect with one's mental health, physical health, and the resulting and devastating effects that systemic oppression can have on entire communities and generations. To say his work is prolific is the understatement of the decade. Everything feels necessary. There is nothing arbitrary about his lyrics, his thematic attention. Everything is exactly the way he has designed it to be, and to great effect, he has released some of the most powerful albums, not only of the last decade, but in all of hip-hop. To understand where Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers is coming from, then, it's important to understand that while Kendrick has certainly been a prolific voice for Black America, one that is unrelenting, one that is wise, and one that is well thought out, he has almost been given this identity as being a savior, one that his audience has kind of dubbed him with. And this is something that has not necessarily been shrugged off by him, right? But I think the exact opposite. I think it weighs very heavily on him, as the idea of survivor's guilt weighs down his music greatly. All of his records feature this running theme. Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers is no exception to that. Where this album differs is that rather than further explore the consequences of systemic oppression on people of color, Mr. Morale stands as an incredibly personal album that sees Kendrick bare all his flaws and regrets to the world. It is very confessional, and it is bound to stir up a whirlwind of emotions and ideas. The album is a story of personal redemption. The arc follows Kendrick fall from grace from within his family and marriage and his own image of himself, and admitting it as a means of disrupting the image perpetuated onto him by his audience. At its core, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers is about seeking redemption and putting in the necessary work as a means to heal oneself for the sake of their family. The album deals with themes of toxic masculinity, which we hear on a number of the interludes about not needing therapy, which, further highlights the discrepancies of mental health between men and women. But also on Father Time, N95, and Auntie Diaries, all songs that look at, the expectations of quote unquote like what being a man is and the pressures that can put on into living up to gender stereotypes and male behavior. This is then coupled with the idea of intergenerational trauma, once again heard on Father Time, and the incredibly poignant Mother I Sober. And then there's further use of the idea of materialism, and he kind of combines this with the idea of reliance on technology and social media. We hear this on the opening track, United in Grief, N95, Rich Spirit, Crown, and Kendrick uses the idea of materialism as consumption as a means of filling the voids from, toxic masculinity, from intergenerational trauma, but then, also filling these voids to project status, as hollow as that may be. The point of the album, however, is not to put the blame of his mistakes onto these themes. That in itself is not redemption. He is rather seeking sources that have contributed to his mindset, perception, and actions, but is then using them as a launchpad to understanding what must be done to actually reconcile and heal. Identifying problems and then putting in the steps and the work, the big steps, if you will, towards the ultimate goal of healing oneself. The idea of healing really comes through on We Cry Together, the super emotional, almost the emotional center of the record, almost. But the super emotional argument between Kendrick Lamar and Taylor Page, someone who should, despite the thematic heaviness of the song, should not be swept under the rug for her contributions. It is designed to look like that between two partners. It's borderline violent at times, and it's a depiction of an incredibly toxic relationship. Before the song begins, there's a little vocal cue that says, "This is how the world sounds." I believe this is Kendrick looking at our social and political divisions and how we see these different issues blow up through not being able to understand one another, comprehend one another, or empathize with one another. And instead we use these controversial issues, these points of contention as a means of exploding at the opposition instead of listening, connecting, learning, and healing as a community. This metaphor ties into the previous issues that Kendrick has found his own faults in. The argument between Lamar and Page doesn't solve anything and instead is rather secular and sees the two attack one another without resolution before moving on to the next point. I think this is his commentary that the world sounds like that of an incredibly abusive and toxic relationship. The song is super uncomfortable to listen to. At times you empathize with Lamar, at times you hate him, and at other points you empathize with Page and then very quickly you'll also hate her. The empathy and frustration, the roller coaster between these two emotions at both parties is so cutting. It is so important, and it really drives home the overall discomfort of listening to this song. It's aggressive and it's incredibly hurtful. I think it is intentionally constructed this way as a means of driving the point that we have an absence of empathy and kindness in how we approach one another, and our overall unwillingness to attempt to understand our differences and where our values come from. Beyond this, the album highlights a number of themes that may contribute to toxic behavior, but Kendrick constantly reaffirms that more must be done than just identifying your problems, as he has done throughout the length of this album. The most prominent, of course, being the tap dancing motif, which is used at the beginning and ends of different songs, especially the ones that are thematically heavy. Father Time, it's used throughout the beginning of the record on United in Grief, and We Cried Together, among others. While it is eventually spelled out later that we are tap dancing around these conversations, it's almost as though Kendrick is saying that identifying these themes and contributing factors, while a valuable first step, does not equal healing. And to think it does means that you are tap dancing around the act of healing and the necessary work that must actually be done. To identify and neglect to go further is dancing around the point, something that has been illustrated quite literally in the case of this album. The album comes full circle with the penultimate song, Mother I Sober. Really, I view this track as the conclusion of the album, with Mirror acting more as an epilogue that kind of summarizes the idea of Lamar choosing himself and apologizing for, turning his back on the wider scope that he once employed on his previous albums. Mother I Sober, on the other hand, is a startlingly sparse arrangement. It's haunted. It has a very haunted feeling to it. It's emotionally raw. It's very uncomfortable, and it highlights how generational trauma has spread directly through his family and how it affects other people as well. It also presents the idea that everyone in the generational chain has the ability to either further perpetuate this trauma on the next link, or can take a stand to put the work in and reduce the effects of such from further spreading. In such context, this is almost the climax of the album, the emotional climax of the album, where Kendrick firmly asserts that he is putting in the work and he is attempting to be better purely for his two children and his wife. And the song itself is incredibly powerful. It's unlike anything else you'll hear in hip hop, and as a means of concluding this album, it really latches onto these themes and brings them into a full circle kind of moment. It's very impactful lyrically, and without it, the album almost would feel incomplete, I would argue. All of this points to the idea that Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers is almost like an anti-hip-hop album. It's very defiant to the expectations anyone would have of a rap record, and it challenges listeners to wrestle with a conceptually heavy album that isn't the most comfortable to wrestle with. From the lack of singles, the conscious step away from bangers, and simply asking the question, should artists deliberately take lateral steps rather than try to outdo their greatest achievements, there's something to be said about Kendrick Lamar's devotion to continuing to challenge himself as an artist, as well as his audience with him. The genre, particularly in the last decade, is truly single heavy. Albums are far less significant now than they were 20 years ago, and while this is an industry-wide phenomenon largely due to our consumption of music through streaming services, this is especially noticeable in hip-hop. With a lack of singles, Kendrick is challenging his listeners to engage in the work in a manner that they may not do on the day-to-day for other artists. I would also argue that very few songs on this record would stand alone outside of the context of Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. In this sense, every song feels like a necessary brick into building constructing this image and this thematically heavy piece of artwork. Everything is necessary, resting on the foundation of the previous track, and again, nothing feels wasted, nothing feels unnecessary. Furthermore, there's a sense of vulnerability that is often absent within the genre. While many artists in hip-hop have expressed their vulnerability from song to song, few, if any, have done so as the central theme for an entire album. And even fewer, again, if any, have done so in such a raw and authentic way that Kendrick has. Furthermore, Kendrick has dispelled his own mythology through Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. What is most interesting to me about this record is how it plays within the image of Kendrick. In our age of social media and artist transparency, we really have lost the mystique. There are less masks, there are less characters in music. There's less mystery. There is really no unknown anymore. Arguably, I would say that Kendrick Lamar and Lady Gaga are among the few artists remaining who have cultivated these deeply captivating personas that have left their audience, consumed with thought. And Kendrick has done so through just his private and his very closed off nature. He's cultivated such a personality and really only allows for shades of himself to be seen from within his music. And then furthermore, is very selective of the interviews and press that he kind of allows into his world. Knowing this, Kendrick intentionally removes the mask to reveal that he is just a man, one who has led himself astray and one who has made choices that he regrets, one affected by the collective trauma felt through his culture and that of his youth, one who is committed to righting his wrongs. It's a really bold move, and despite removing the mask, we don't know if this is the full picture, and we never truly will know. But where he's coming from, such a place of mystery and unknown, it's refreshing and almost startling to see such a reveal through the record. And it's rare. It's rare to see an artist dispel their own mythology. We never got to see someone like Prince do that. And when people like Bowie or like Andre 3000 let their guard down, it still left everyone wondering what was real versus what was just another twist to the mystery. And in quite the contradictory fashion, in dispelling his own myth, Kendrick has maybe further added to it. It's a curious step to take, and it's certainly an incredibly bold move, one that is a fascinating study into identity and how that plays into popular culture. While not his strongest release, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers very well may be among the most interesting and deeply thematic albums to grace popular music, perhaps ever. Few albums could cultivate such a level of fascination and could simultaneously play on the central values of a musical genre along with the artist's own personal identity. And that in itself almost makes it a masterpiece. I applaud Kendrick Lamar for taking such bold steps in a territory that could have been incredibly risky for his career, further establishing why he is among the biggest, most popular, and greatest artists of our time in every regard. Next week, tune in for one final episode which looks at music from 2022, where we discuss the significance behind a pair of records from the Red Hot Chili Peppers and how that plays with the band's role as a legacy act. If you like today's episode, connect with me on Instagram and TikTok at Beats by Jer. Thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Jared Harris, and this has been Beats by Jer.